Welcome to 10 Frames Per Second, a podcast about photojournalism with photojournalists for everyone. Hosted by J.M. Giordano and Elena Volkova.
Welcome back to 10 Frames Per Second. Hi, Elena.
Hi, Joe.
We have a very fantastic guest today about a super important topic. A piece that was written in the Columbia Journalism Review by Kristen, who is a freelance journalist. She covers migration, women's issues, and human rights in Europe and the Middle East. She's been published in everywhere from Washington Post, LA Times, Foreign Policy, and the list really goes on. So welcome to the podcast, Kristen.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So we decided we're going to let you talk about your piece in CJR, how it came to be, and a little backstory on, or just the steps to publication. So we're going to let you talk about your own story quickly.
Great. Well, I spent about 5.5 months on the story, and it came about because when Vox reported that Patrick Whitty was dismissed from National Geographic after an investigation for sexual harassment, it really opened up a conversation in the industry that hadn't been happening openly to that extent before. And so CJR asked me to write this piece, which I was really happy to do because, as a writer, I'm not a part of the photojournalism industry, but I had heard my colleagues talking about this issue and was really eager to sort of take it on. So I spent months basically just interviewing photojournalists, mostly women, but also men, and talking about how bad the problem is, the extent of the problem, some of the issues or aspects of the industry that allow it to flourish, and then ended up publishing some of the names of people and institutions who were, harassing people or allowing that to happen on their watch.
How long did it take you to write the piece?
Well, it was a work in progress for a long time, so it's difficult to answer that question. I think I submitted a first draft months and months ago, so my editors could sort of see where I was going. And that was just a few thousand words, and they were so gracious to give me more time and space when I said that I thought we could do better and do more and actually name names. And so they were really great to give me more time, and it ballooned, to almost 10,000 words. So I'm really, really grateful to them for giving me all of that space.
You interviewed a lot of women for this piece. Just curious about the process. How did you approach the women, and how did you gather stories, and how did you make a decision which stories are going to be in the piece published, including the names of the photographers who are there and those who are just referred to as photographers? Right.
Well, I started with my network, sort of just putting the word out among photographers who I know that I was writing this piece, and if anyone wanted to speak with me, to please get in touch. And I posted in some Facebook groups for women journalists as well, and the word just kind of spread, and I was kind of deluged with responses, and I was interviewing people, from like LA to Bangkok. So like in all different time zones all over the world. In the first few weeks, I was like interviewing people in the middle of the night and during all hours of the day, because all of the time zone issues, and it was kind of intense. So I spent a lot of time, talking to these women and sort of figuring out what the extent of the problem and sort of what were the issues that needed to be focused on. And what I kind of wanted to avoid was just another story that had a bunch of sort of anonymous accounts that said, oh, it's so bad. This is just a really terrible problem. And what I wanted to do more was to sort of identify the kind of specific aspects of the industry or practices or whatever that made this problem worse or that allowed it to happen. And then I also wanted to, as much as possible, to name names, because I think that's the only way that people pay attention and that this problem stops. And so, so I did a lot of reporting, trying to gather enough accounts that I was able to have a really solid account that named people.
Yeah, it seemed like going through the piece, there were just 2 photographers named, right?
That's right.
Throughout the piece. How was it decided on those 2, and why weren't more named in the piece?
So there were 2 sort of issues with that. One was I had to have multiple accounts about one person in order to name him, just to, uphold good journalism practices. I wanted to have multiple accounts to make the story really strong. So that was one issue, was gathering multiple accounts about specific people, and then another was the willingness of the women. There are a lot of women who spoke with me and told me about accounts, and they were willing to go on the record with their names, which was, I think, really courageous. But in some cases, they didn't want to name the man, and there were different reasons for that. Some of them thought, the behavior that they experienced was bad, but they didn't feel like it was on the level where they wanted to sort of, him to think they were trying to ruin his career. Like, they think this is a problem and it needs to stop, but they didn't necessarily want to, as they would say, put him on blast. Mm-hmm. So it was basically a combination of the women who are willing to come forward about specific men and how much I was able to gather. And then also how they fit into, I wanted, accounts that illustrated these deeper problems in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the women were open to these conversations, or did you feel that maybe some women were open to naming names and some were a little reluctant? And how does that reflect where women stand in the industry and maybe their age and experience?
I found that across the board, generally, the younger the women were who I spoke with, the more willing they were to use their own names in the story and also to name their harassers, the perpetrators. And I thought that was a really interesting observation. It just seemed like the younger photographers were more eager and willing to speak out.
Mm. And speaking of like an age gap, or I don't want to say generation gap because generations are stupid, but for an age gap, was there, these photographers' names seem to be pretty, well, they're older. I know Kratovil is well over 50. I can't speak for Rodriguez, but I'm sure he's been around for quite some time. Was there, an age gap with the harassers where you were finding that, well, Antonin's just like that, and this is how it is, versus maybe not so much with younger male? And I'm assuming you said earlier you spoke to male and female. Did you speak to male victims, or was it harassers that you spoke to? Sorry for the sidebar question, but I wanted to get that.
No, not at all. Right. I did not speak to any male victims, but interestingly enough, since the story has been published, several people have messaged me saying they experienced abuse from these men as well that they wanted to talk to me about. But while reporting the story, the men I spoke to were generally men who were, fed up with this kind of behavior in the industry. And among the harassers, women named harassers from all ages. It wasn't only older men. Antonin Kartachvili is, I think, around 70, so he is, on the older end of the spectrum. I think Rodriguez is maybe around 40. I'm not quite sure.
I thought he was older.
He's a bit younger, yeah. Women generally said that it felt like many of the older men in the industry came from a culture that was more abusive to women, and that in general, many of the older men did sort of hold to this macho glorification of masculinity and permissiveness of harassment that seemed to be a culture in photojournalism, more so in the past, and it's now fading, but not as quickly as they would like it to. But they also named younger harassers, younger men. So I think that it might be more so among the older generation, but not exclusively so.
I wonder if it's in terms of the culture, and we are pretty aware about gender issues in the United States, but in your experience, and you've traveled a lot, what is the culture in other countries? I'm from Ukraine. I know it's a big issue in Eastern Europe, and nobody really is really willing to address it or to talk about it, including women. It's just not considered to be an issue. From your perspective, do you feel like there's a sort of a culture differences how people approach the issue of harassment?
Oh, sure, definitely. I think it's seen as in some places it's more permissible than it is in others, and I definitely saw this with the women who spoke to me about Christian Rodriguez. So most of them were Latin American photographers. They were from Colombia, Uruguay, Ecuador, Mexico, and they, 8 of them spoke to me on the record, which was pretty amazing. But it felt, I think, like the consequences maybe were higher for them. They talked about not being so supported by their in society, and even sometimes their families. So I think it can be a lot harder for people in some places to speak out, definitely.
And talk a little bit about, we had discussed the issue of Seven, the international photo agency, which Kratovil is, was hopefully a member of. Talk about the culture within the organization and how they did or didn't respond to accusations.
I spoke to several former members of the agency. I didn't speak to any current members. And I think that probably tells you a lot, that all of the people who were willing to speak about this culture were no longer members of the agency. But they described a place that was really hostile for women. They said that, that Antonin was not the only one who was harassing women, and that his behavior, the behavior that I report in the article, it happened at agency meetings. It happened in front of colleagues. And I also report that there was a complaint made to the board about his harassment of one member, and nothing was done about it. So they all told me that it was really just a hostile place where harassment was acceptable. It wasn't, nothing was done about it, even when official complaints were made.
Mm-hmm.
Did you hear from Seven? Did they send you any statements or contact you regarding this?
They did. So after I contacted them with my questions, they removed Antonin Kratochvil's page. They basically removed him from their website, and they told me that they had suspended him and were initiating an independent investigation. And they said that they took the well-being of their female members seriously, and that they had in recent years, tried to make it a better place for their women members.
I wondered, were there any questions? I don't know. Of course, you're not in a position to press them, but they had plenty of opportunities to address this.
Yeah. I mean, is there going to be a follow-up with them? Because, again, I think that I don't think there is an investigation. I think it's like the end of, the scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? With, we have top people looking into it, and they're like, who? Like top people, and then it just ends up being put into a warehouse, right? The artifact. So, is there going to be any follow up? I mean, we saw this in a lot of the other industries, like fashion. They had 3 of their big male names go down, kind of expelled from the industry. But and then it seems that's it. right? And there doesn't seem to be. It's almost like the industry or the organization's like, okay, he's gone.
Right.
Let's hope no one bothers us again, right? Because I can tell you, they probably think they're being bothered with this stuff. Having been a photo editor, the publications, the deadline rules, right? The money rules. So is there, is there going to be any follow up, or what should happen after the fallout?
I definitely think that Seven is behaving the way you just described. They are trying to push this onto one member and not take responsibility as a whole, and sort of think that if they, suspend him, then it's over. I will definitely be following what happens, and I hope that I'll be able to write a follow-up story. But if people just let this go and sort of say, well, okay, they suspended him, that's enough, I think that would be really disappointing. I think that top people in the industry need to start taking this seriously and put pressure on places like this and say that it's not okay. It's pretty obvious that the agency was aware of this behavior and that he was not the only photographer engaged in this kind of behavior there, and it was accepted. And so they can't just pin it on him and sort of say that they've now implemented, a way to report harassment and that everything is fine. That doesn't address what happened. And I think it doesn't, but just by removing him from their website, they don't absolve themselves of responsibility for what happened on their watch.
And what happens if you're a freelancer and you're not part of an agency like Seven, which would happen in the case of Rodriguez, right?
Right. Yeah. That makes accountability really difficult. Because who do you complain to? Of course, in the case of Seven, women did complain. At least one member did complain to the board, and nothing happened. So maybe that having someone to complain to doesn't always work. But when the perpetrator is a freelancer, then it's even messier, because who do you complain to? And a lot of these women, in this case, Rodriguez was shooting for National Geographic, and many of these women would love to work for National Geographic, and they didn't want to go to the National Geographic editor and complain about harassment, and maybe, that would have professional consequences for them. So it's a really difficult question that I think the industry needs to grapple with and come up with an answer for.
And the one freelancer who complained about him, I think it was to a female editor, right? And she said she didn't read the email, and then his piece came out, and then they addressed it. First of all, I think I hate this industry sometimes. That's again, the deadline. I know, being a photo editor, if I had an email from a name that I recognized, I would definitely open it and read it. There was no way I would miss that email. Which I don't know the editor. I'm not calling her out. I just know in my situation I would have opened it, but I'm kind of calling a little BS on that they didn't read it. But they wanted to wait till the issue was finished and came out to address it. Why do you think that is with, with a female editor? You would think she's more sympathetic, but did you find that the editor breakdown of people who, had reported these incidents to was male, female? Was there some kind of ratio for that? And if so, what's your opinion on why it wasn't reported?
Yeah, no, I don't know if she saw that message, but and she said that she didn't, but certainly the way it looks to those women is that she just ignored it, and that is what leads women to not want to make those complaints. And yes, that editor is a woman, and there are a lot of top editors who are women, and this is a point that people sometimes who are defensive about this issue use to say, well, if the top editors are women, then really this problem can't be that bad. But what they're ignoring is that women are sometimes part of the problem. And I didn't find that women I spoke to were more or less likely to complain, to a woman editor than a man. And actually some of the women I spoke to told me that it's something that they're not proud of, but that they had, basically considered that there were only a few spots at the table in this industry for women, and they were competing against other women for those spots at the table. And they're not proud of it, but they thought that that's just the way things were and what they had to do. And I think that's something women are starting to question and reject now. But that sort of mindset, which comes from this culture in photojournalism, means that even if you have some women at the top, it doesn't necessarily mean that this problem goes away.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, are there any policies exist? I mean, any organization has sexual harassment policies, right? It's almost impossible to go, I mean, I don't know, in my field, in institutions in academia, these policies are in place and you have to go through numerous workshops every year. And I'm wondering, aren't there policies that all employees or even freelancers, if they're working for a newspaper, they should be able to comply with a policy like that?
Yeah, I think a lot of places have policies, but I think there's a big difference between what's on paper and what the culture of the publication is. I spoke with one woman who worked at an agency that definitely had a sexual harassment policy, and yet she was harassed by her editor for years and complained twice to management and human resources, and nothing was done about it. So just because there's a policy in place doesn't mean, that it's followed. And what we're seeing now is also places like the Eddie Adams Workshop and Seven putting a policy in place, saying we have this code of conduct now, or we have this, this way to report or whatever, and act as if that kind of solves the problem. When, in reality, you have to, having people sign a piece of paper doesn't change a culture, and also it doesn't make women believe that you want to protect them if you've spent years ignoring their complaints.
Yeah.
And I mean, didn't Eddie Adams, the person's on the board, right?
On the advisory council, yes. I mean, I have emails showing that there was a complaint of sexual harassment made about this person, and like a month or two later, they put him on the advisory council. So, I mean, how can you expect women to believe that you're going to take their complaint seriously when you ignore complaints like that, and not only ignore it, but actually elevate that person to have a deeper role at the workshop where he's dealing with young students.
In journalism, which is your field, do you see that this is similar? Now it's all these, as the women are speaking out, we find out that it's not really specific to the industry or the media. It's really everywhere. It's really
white men. I mean, let's just cut to the chase on that one. It's got nothing to do with, if there were no industries, we'd still have an issue,
And what can we do about it? What are the solutions? What could the organizations do?
Well, I mean, it's definitely, obviously, a problem that cuts across every industry and non-industry. But what I kind of explored in the story is there are a few things about photojournalism, and maybe some of them apply to all of journalism as well, that sort of exacerbate the problem, like the reliance on freelancers, which poses problems for accountability. And also particularly for photojournalism, workshops seem to be a pretty big problem, where older photographers are sort of preying on the young students. And that's, we don't really do workshops in writing as much as I think photojournalists do. But I think, and I don't have all the answers, and I think people in the industry need to have a long discussion about what can be done. But I think that, change doesn't start until people at the top of the industry make clear that they care about this, and they want to know who these people are, and they want to know what's happening. And when people come forward and report, they will be protected. And, that has to be more than just words. It has to be more than just a piece of paper, because otherwise it can't be trusted.
So is expulsion enough as a punishment?
I think the punishment depends on, the behavior and the circumstances and the institution and what they decide. I'm not sure if there's a, one size fits all punishment, but what I do know is that in many of these cases, women have talked about no punishment at all, just their complaints not be taken seriously. And in reality, often the women bear the consequences. The women who reported the behavior face consequences, and the men don't. I mean, I talked to women, multiple women who left Seven Agency at a really prestigious place that they would have loved to have continued being a member of, and they left because which had an impact on their career because of the harassment, and women, who left other publications and companies and even the field. So I think, whatever, I'm not sure what the punishment should be in each case, but if we continue making women bear the consequences and not the perpetrators, then, we're obviously not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, I wonder in the case of Seven, because several of the female photographers left, if there'd be maybe a class action suit. Have you talked to any legal, in the course of your interviews? I mean, keeping with the piece. I mean, did you speak to any lawyers or any attorneys or anyone that could say, hey, they probably have a case here?
I didn't. That's an interesting idea, but I didn't address that.
Because it seems like if there was an exodus for that reason, that might be could be grounds for some kind of discrimination class action suit.
Yeah.
Which would be. Did you find any of the other big agencies, were they mentioned by any victims, like Magnum? And I guess America only has really a few. Most of them tend to be more international, right? LA. I mean, the French agency, Presse France, but I mean, were there any other agencies that had such egregious kind of turning a blind eye to this stuff as Seven did?
Yeah, I mean, definitely Seven is not the only one. They are the one that I was able to include in the story. But there's a lot of people and a lot of agencies and a lot of publications that I was not able to include. So it's definitely not limited to Seven.
And you think you'll be following up with this?
Yeah, I hope to, and I'm still doing some more reporting, and more people have now reached out to me since the story has been published. So I'm hoping to do more.
There's a question. I hate to ask it, and John, please work with us. And I don't even know how to ask it, but we thought we kind of thought about it, and we're not trying to play devil's advocate or make excuses for anybody, but is there a difference between a harasser and a rapist? And how is that line navigated? Because women have put up with this behavior for generations. I don't know if I asked this question correctly, but do you want to talk about this, Kristen?
Yeah, sure. I mean, absolutely. I think there's a difference between harassment and rape. But I think, that so there are some people who would say, well, it wasn't that bad what he did. He didn't rape you, so why are you complaining about it? And, I think that kind of attitude has kept a lot of these women quiet for a long time, because even women I spoke to who had horrific things happen to them, they would say, well, it wasn't that bad, so I'm just not sure if I should come forward and say his name. And, from my point of view and the point of view of my editors, it was terrible what happened to them. So definitely there's a difference. And, going back to the question of punishment, like obviously that's not something I decide, but, I don't think there's a one size fits all punishment or consequences. And I think we've seen a little bit of that in maybe not the photojournalism world, but the media world, where, newspapers have suspended people and moved them to different beats, and others have been fired. So we've seen differing consequences for differing behavior. And, I think that's something that makes sense, and that the industry and the publications can explore. But I hope that women don't consider everything except rape, acceptable or something that's not worth complaining about.
Yeah. I remember the conversation happening with one of my friends who is also Eastern European about how if a woman benefits from this sort of transaction, to call it a rape or harassment, then there shouldn't be any complaints. And I think that his voice was not just his, right? A lot of men think that, well, if there is an agreement that both of us benefit from this, then it's okay. And just stories like yours and other accounts just make a really powerful statement that help even women to understand what is okay and what is not. Because sometimes there is, if we don't do it from spreading awareness and education in schools, for example, or at home when you're raising your children, I think that's where the whole culture starts from, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just these cases do not just happen when you're an adult. It comes from learning about the world when you're little and thinking that this is an okay behavior.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the Kratavil. I mean that's he was enabled by pretty much everybody, right? I mean, his and listeners, you can read about it in Kristen's piece, but there was a serious grouping. It was, I think, borders on or is pretty much rape. I mean, the way it's described in your piece is not just a simple grope. This guy's pretty bad. But it has to start with the editors not enabling and just so listening to your writers, listening to your photographers, and taking it seriously. I mean, that's the root of how this is going to. It's not going to heal because men are going to be men no matter what, and we're horrible, we're terrible, and it's just not. But if the people on top take this seriously, then maybe these men will think twice about harassing a female colleague. Or if they know that it's not going to be put up with in the organization, I'm interested to see where 7 takes us, and I'd like to see either you, Kristen, or another, just someone, just keep checking in with them like every month. Or how's the investigation going? Are you done yet? Are you done yet? No, really, because I agree with you. I think that they're just gonna, oh, okay, he's gone, so we're all good now, and not really look at the systemic issues they have within the organization. I mean, outwardly, I personally was kind of stunned at 7 because I follow them on Instagram, I follow them on Twitter, and I see a lot of female moderators and workshops. I see, just from what I see, I'm nowhere near that high up in the stratosphere where I know these people, but their outward appearance. I mean, do you agree with that? I mean, do you now? I'm speaking of the now, not in the past, but what I see. No,
absolutely, yeah. I think it was last fall they drastically expanded. The agency admitted 12 new members, and 6 of them were women, and they also admitted people of color as well. So I think they made a pretty concerted effort to become more diverse recently, and they've clearly recognized that they were mostly a bunch of white guys, and made an effort to include more women and people of color, and I think that's a great thing. But if you do that without acknowledging what has happened, and without acknowledging the people who are still in the agency who have harassed people and abused people, I don't think that's really a good faith effort at making things better.
Mm-hmm. And did you find or do you think in the course of this article anyone, like I read, I think it was in Vox, I read about one of the victims from the National Geographic guy, had said that she had found out that, her name was out there as like, oh, she's a problem, like you don't want to deal. So she was losing gigs from editors for speaking out. Did you find anyone that felt they were being punished for their actions?
Oh, absolutely. I spoke with several people who didn't want to be part, they spoke with me like off the record, or on background because they feel like they've already lost a lot in their careers because of speaking out about this before. And then I spoke to others who decided not to speak about specific things or not to speak on the record because they were, afraid of damaging their careers. There's definitely people who are known as troublemakers or, as people who talk about that stuff. And it has real consequences for them, which is why I think it's, really incredible that all those women spoke on the record in the story.
Mm-hmm. Are more names coming?
I hope so. I can't say for sure, but I hope so.
We have a deep question for you. And there have been some conversations about this, but I don't think enough, is can you separate art from the artist? And famous, the filmmakers whose movies we love and the composers. My favorite example is Richard Wagner, who was a terrible anti-Semite, How do you, what is your opinion on how should we as consumers of images navigate this line?
It's a difficult question. But I think there are so many amazing photographers who are not predators. And I think, maybe it's not a question of throwing away books that we have, but looking for, other photographers, women, younger people, people of color, men who are not predators, and looking at their work too, because I think they have so much to offer and they're doing amazing work. And, in some cases they're being squeezed out by these iconic, really talented people who are also, harassing women and abusing women.
What do you think, Joe? Do you have an opinion?
I mean, it's tough. I mean, I just going by the piece, I'm not familiar with Rodriguez's work, but I mean, Crataville is, he's up there with, Paulo Pellegrin, Lindsay Adaro, like these photojournalists that I once respected, in the field. I mean, it's going to be hard for me not to like his work. Where, I mean, obviously you can't say it because they're on college radio, but I'll leave that open. So yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to see, how galleries respond to this. I'm waiting, for the shoe to drop on someone bigger like Salgado. What happens if, decades of women come forward about him? I mean, his work is in museums, his work is in galleries, his books are everywhere. He's like this kind of in the gods of, male photojournalism. He's kind of the Zeus, right? So it's an interesting question that I think, I don't know. I mean, we talked about it earlier, in film, Polanski and Woody Allen, Woody Allen accused, by his daughter, and Polanski, is basically assaulted a minor. To me, I mean, it's not different. That's the thing. You can't. The phrasing. It's very difficult. As a male and a consumer of this, it's hard to know what to do. I mean, definitely on the side of the women for the actions. And I'm not. I'm done with Crataville after reading this, but do I go through my library and throw the books away? I mean, probably. It's so fresh. I have to think on it. But I think that's going to be a question, at least in photojournalism, when someone is bigger than him. Because he's really not. He's not like Salgado is huge, and if it comes out about
nothing
him,
came out about Salgado. Just for the record.
No. I'm not accusing, and I mean, I hope the listeners actually listen to what I'm saying. Is that if it does, or someone of his stature is these accusations or these incidences, these victims come forward about something that someone that big has done, what do galleries and museums do? I mean, what do you do about Paul Gauguin? I mean, Gauguin abandoned his family, right? He went down to the islands and pretty much abused these people. Read it in the diaries. This isn't empty accusations. Do you? I don't see galleries and museums scrambling to get the Gauguins off their wall.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is a question, right? I'm still trying to figure out and make sense out of all this. Or can we say, well, the culture was that, and now we're trying to change it? And what can we expect from these men who maybe just now realizing how their behavior is hurting people? I mean, we just had a big conversation about Louis C.K. and I'm in total shock. I would like what would I like to see him do? Community service, starting some big organization that will actually fight this. I don't know. And will that be authentic? So I think, in a way, I blame it on culture that, and not, I'm not trying to absolve them, right? But if a culture, especially in Eastern Europe, and Kratovil is Czech, he's probably a product of his culture. It doesn't mean that what he did was right, but understandable.
Well, that's your. Bit. I mean, that's where your section, Central Europe, Eastern Europe.
Eastern Europe, yeah.
And that's what I like, having lived in Prague for a long time. That kind of harassment was, Kat, my wife was, there was incidents that she talked about at the paper where she worked that, female reporters were constantly asked to sit on ministers' laps and things like that, or come over to the hot tub for stories. And they reported it, and the men were just like, oh, come on. And that's the part of the world I worry about, is the part where the women aren't taken seriously at all.
I have a story from someone who talked to me for this story, and it's not included in the published article, who had, not to say it's not worse in some parts of the world, but literally at a student photojournalism conference, the head of a photo agency asked her to come discuss her portfolio with him in the hot tub. So, it's not, it's obviously worse in some places than others, but, and it's harder to speak up in some places, but it's still pretty damn hard in America too.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not saying that it's not. I'm just saying, like Elena was saying, having lived there, and she's from, like that, you were saying, like that part of the world, it's just it's just not taking that, it's not taking that seriously.
Sure.
As it is. And I mean, I think do you think it's getting better here? I mean, what do you think, Chris? I mean, you're in the industry, so, has the organizations you work for, has it gotten better with the way that you're dealt with, personally?
I haven't experienced a lot of harassment from colleagues. I've experienced a lot of harassment and assault in the field, but not so much from colleagues, which is maybe because I am a freelancer and kind of work on my own a lot. But I do think from the women I've spoken to that I do think it's getting better. Yeah. I mean, I think we're seeing, a year ago, I don't think all of these women would have spoken to me for the story. So I think it's getting better. It's slow. And we're definitely far from there, but I think it's moving in the right direction.
Great.
Cool. Well, thanks for being on the podcast, Kristen. It was fantastic.
It was my pleasure.
Well, we have a link to the article in our in the show notes. So if you're a subscriber onto iTunes or Overcast or any other of the podcast feeds, you should be able to click on it and read this fantastic, very, very important article. And I hope you'll come back on the show, come back on the podcast, even in a year. I'd really like to see where this where this goes. If I guess it comes down to keeping on people or keeping on organizations like Seven to hold them to account, because if they say they're going to do something, they should do it.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I plan on keeping on them and staying on this. So I'd love to come back and discuss later and let's see what happens or doesn't happen.
Keep us posted via Twitter message or whatever. And if you think something really big comes up, or you're about to, or after you publish your next big piece, we'd love that. We'll definitely make space for you. We'd love to have you back on.
That'd be great.
And we have rapid fire questions. We don't know if we should ask you that, but from somebody who is a journalist and understands the power of storytelling, maybe we can give it a shot. What do you think?
Go for it.
Okay.
You got it.
All right, Kristen, 3 questions. Photography is primarily a tool for?
Storytelling.
When I look at an image, I look for?
That's terrible. I always look at the caption first.
Oh, that's great. That's actually amazing.
I'm such a writer. I always look at the words
Yes.
first. It's terrible.
Yeah, that's great. Photographer is responsible for?
I hope they should be responsible for their colleagues and the way they treat them.
Great.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Those have been the best answers so far. Like,
Yeah.
seriously. I have to ask a writer. That's why.
Yeah.
The photographers, we're stupid. They're like, oh, photographers are responsible for taking pictures. That's great. Well, thanks a lot, Kristen. Thanks for being a guest, and you're welcome to come back on anytime. We'd love to have you back.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
This has been 10 Frames Per Second, recorded at WLOI Radio at Loyola University, Maryland. Produced by Audrey Gatewood and John DeBeck.